Good morning, everyone. Well, I see that it is now quarter after, which means that's the starting time. Now, if we could kind of remove the cobwebs and everything, because it's been a while, right? No Sunday school for Christmas, which was on a Sunday. No Sunday school on New Year's, which was a Sunday. And so today we're bouncing back, and we're continuing pretty much where we left off. So we're making our way through the book of Ruth, and so Ruth is a Moabite woman, right? And she married a Jewish man when Naomi and Mahlon and Chilion kind of moved to her home area, which was Moab, and her husband. So, anyways, her father-in-law died, and her husband died, and so now they're both back in Judah, in Bethlehem, which is Naomi's home turf, home area. Of course, here you have a widow, right, and a daughter-in-law, and the societal structure was such that pretty much it was the men who brought in income. Women attended to what we would say are domestic tasks mostly. And so, you can kind of see how the division of labor worked. And in many ways, it's to a large degree, it's still that way somewhat today. Okay? And, of course, what is different from today is property rights did not pass on. It passed on to the son. And that's the reason why you have these kind of weird laws in Israel. We would say they're weird, but it's to ensure that the property rights pass on to the descendants of a particular father. And so we'll kind of get into that a little bit, okay? So Naomi and Ruth are back in Judea, but they have to live somehow, right? They're not farmers, right? So men own the fields, men farm the lands, men grind the grain. So what women would do is women would take the grain and they would grind it and make it into flour. And then, often men would even do that because you have the kind of the mill where the grain is ground and all that sort of stuff. So they're kind of in a pickle, aren't they? How are they going to live? How are they going to eat? Well, we will learn of certain things that exist within Israel's structure that help ensure that help keep homelessness from happening, to help keep people from dying of starvation and whatnot. Okay? So, and one of the things that the culture had, which God had commanded of his people of old, was to allow people to glean grain. Okay? So gleaning grain is what? What we would probably say picking up the leftover grain, picking up the grain that's left behind. Because whenever you harvest, there's going to be some grain that falls off the plant. Seeds are going to fall off the stalk. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, right? And so poor people, or widows, orphans, etc., are all allowed to kind of gather grain that way and use it. And in fact, it's mandated by law to allow that to happen. And then there are specific sections of the field which are not supposed to be harvested at all. Okay? And these are the edges and the corners, which usually have a lower yield anyway. If you've ever kind of driven by farm fields and you kind of you kind of look at the plants, it's the one right near the edge that are normally the scrawniest and aren't doing the best. And I'll say, is that true, Mike? No. Oh, Mike's a conceptual farmer. Of course, I'm judging this based on corn, where I would kind of see the plants get smaller and that sort of thing. So, okay, but here we're talking about barley. Okay, that's primarily what was being grown in Bethlehem. So we're in Ruth chapter 2. Okay, and we'll start at verse 7. Okay, now remember, we need to be aware of what gleaning is. It's folks picking up the bits of grain after the sheaves are harvested. Okay? So they're bundled and taken away, and then the field is empty. Then they're allowed to do that. That's how it's supposed to work. Okay, so Ruth 2, verse 7. Then Boaz, so now we're kind of saying, Boaz and Ruth, they're kind of now getting to meet each other and stuff. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Not really his daughter, but okay. He's recognizing kinship here. That's what that means. Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close. Oh, that's verse 8, sorry. She said, now this is Ruth speaking, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and as she continued, she came and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. This is a little problematic because a couple things could be going on, okay? But it seems as if Ruth is kind of asking for going beyond normal gleaning, okay? And so we may not catch that, but she's asking if she could follow those harvesting, right? Instead of waiting till they've all bundled the sheaves and then taken the grain away to where it's going to be milled and the chaff removed, etc., right? So she's kind of, that's not how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to wait till the harvesting is done. Then you could do that. So she either wants a jump on the other gleaners because she'll get to glean immediately before the other ones are allowed to, right? Or maybe she'll be able to get more grain because she's expecting to get some from those who are harvesting the grain as opposed to only gleaning. See, so the text is, we can't say with certainty, but we'll know later on when we realize how much grain she brings home. Okay? So, and you don't need permission to glean. It's the law. It's allowed. Everyone could do it. You don't need permission. So the fact that she's asking permission implies what? That she's doing something that's not normal gleaning. Well, hey, I kind of want to get the jump on the other gleaners, so I want to kind of travel immediately behind the guys harvesting the grain and pick up the grain, right? So she's going to get a lot more, okay? She's asking the field supervisor, in a sense, you'd say, well, he's not really authorized to do that. He's supervising the grain harvest. And he's thinking, well, if I let gleaners come behind me immediately before we're done, we're not going to harvest as much grain and take it to where the mill where we're going to grind it. So what should he do? Sure, because I could tell you're down on your luck. Well, he doesn't own the farm field. He's working for his boss who owns the farm field. So, so what's happening is Ruth is kind of waiting, but she's really waiting to receive permission to do this. And this is the thing that we probably won't catch, okay? That this is kind of what's happening, okay? And so there she is. She kind of wants special treatment. Why should she get special treatment? I mean, why? What do you think? Would you think she would deserve extra treatment? I mean, yeah, we want to help people, but, right? She's a Moabite. She's not even an Israelite. So you would think, who are you? Go away. You can come back when we're done harvesting and glean just like everybody else. Okay? That would seem like the proper response. But so the field supervisor, what does this tell us? Because as I messed up and I read verse 8 instead of 7 at the beginning, this lets us know that Boaz is a generous man, and the work supervisor knows that. So he doesn't immediately send Ruth off and say, go home and leave. Okay? He's saying, well, okay, when I have a chance to talk to my boss, I'll let him know, and then we'll see what happens. Okay? So all of this stuff is happening that we may not notice. Okay? And we're going to just let that sit there because, and we know this is the case because the amount of grain that Ruth gets is ridiculous. So she did not do normal gleaning. So when you hear that, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. Okay? And then, of course, what would happen if we're listening to this, we go, oh, yeah, it could be, or it could be. And then when we hear the amount that she harvests, we'll go, what? Then we know. Okay, the scales will be lifted from our eyes. Okay? So let's read verses 8 and 9. And there's a good chance Boaz might know something because he's related to whom? Right, he's related to Naomi. And which means he's related to Ruth by marriage. Right? Okay. Okay, verses 8 and 9. Then Boaz said to Ruth, so now what didn't happen is what isn't told is the supervisor talked to Boaz, said, hey, there's this woman, and she wants special treatment when it comes to gleaning, and I know you're a generous man, but I just didn't want to tell her yes, because then, who knows, everybody might come and try to do this like crazy type of gleaning, and then our yield will be much smaller because they'll be taking stuff from the stalks, etc. Okay? So he talks to Boaz, and Boaz returns, and now Ruth and Boaz are having a conversation. So then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Okay? So he's saying, okay, glean from my field. So he already knows the whole situation. And by calling her daughter, it could just be a term of, in a sense, respect, but it also could be, hey, I know that you're kin. Okay? Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Okay. So wherever you see my young women, meaning what? People who are affiliated, either wives of the husbands who are working, whatever. You can glean in any of my fields, is what he's saying. And how can you know? Well, you can recognize the people. Okay. And if you get thirsty, you can get water from the fields. So from the field hands who are working. What? So what did he say without actually saying so? To get water from the field hands who are working means what? That you're there when they're there. Okay? So he's giving implicit permission to glean in a special way where she's immediately following the harvesters, not waiting till it's all done. Okay? So, and if Boaz is the boss, right, and you're a harvester, I'll throw her a few stalks because she's important to my boss, and I want to keep my boss happy, right? So you have this sort of dynamic thing going on, which is not even stated. But when we kind of read and we go, oh yeah, well, to get the water from the field hands, then you have to be there when they're working, which means you're gleaning when they're harvesting, not after they're done. Okay, all of this stuff. If we understand kind of the gleaning process and we understand how everything works, we realize that Boaz is being very generous. Okay, so in some way he has to know that she's family. Okay, and remember last week when he said, well, to whom does she belong? Which is, we would go, what? That's kind of odd. But really, it's like, who is she married to? All right? Because you want to... So right there, and if you go, oh, well, she doesn't belong to anyone, then you know, oh, well, she's not married. So that means what? Well, he could ask her out on a date or whatever, right? And it's like, oh, well, she belongs to blah, blah, blah. Oh, well, in that case, I won't do it. In that sense, it's kind of like a woman wearing a wedding band. It's supposed to do that, right? So like if you're some dude on the prowl and you see a woman with a wedding ring, you go, oh, she's married, I'm supposed to respect that. Supposed to. But we know how the world is. Oh yeah, so that's the whole layout. A lot of stuff going on. We have to be keen. We have to be a keener for the gleaner. Okay, never mind, that was bad. Okay, verse 10. Boo, we could see why you're not a comedian, Pastor. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why would she do this? She's being very respectful. She's not worshiping him, but she's honoring him. Exactly. She goes, whoa, this guy's giving me way more special treatment than I deserve. He's really looking after me. He says, in fact, don't go gleaning anywhere else because I'm going to make sure that you're protected. And so she does this. So she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes? So Boaz, since he's an Israelite, he goes, well, I know Moabite women are supposed to be bad, but I also heard they're kind of hot. So, But so he notices Ruth, okay? Why have I found favor in your eyes, and why should you take notice of me since I am a foreigner? Yeah, see? There's no reason. I mean, you don't even have to show this much favor to an Israelite, to a Judean, and yet you're doing this to me, a foreigner. So she recognizes the dynamic. This is not normal. So, yeah. And the text kind of does this because, by the words that it's employed, the rhetoric, it uses a phrase with a lot of alliteration which calls attention to itself. And it's the exact place where she says, why do you notice me? It would be something like, have you noticed me, the unnoticed? Kind of even the meaning there's a little bit of repetition there to kind of emphasize that she knows that she should be unnoticed, and yet he notices her. So there are these little bits of things that just kind of happen. So what's unfolding is we're set up for something pretty serious to happen, okay? And I think we would have to be really dense not to think that's the case. Okay? Are we ready? Let's press on. Okay? So let's look at verse 11. Okay? But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law. Uh-oh. What do we now know that Boaz knows? All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a place that you did not know before. Wow. So he knows who Ruth is, doesn't he? He knows the story, at least enough of it to go, wow, she didn't have to come here. But yet there's this loyalty that she has to her mother-in-law. So there's this whole background. Now, how much of this he was told, we don't know. But he knows enough, and he is admiring her for doing this. So to him, loyalty matters. Okay? And so he respects Ruth for having such family loyalty to Naomi. Okay? And he tells her that. So he knows that her husband dies. He knows that Naomi's husband dies. So, yeah, because he's related. But so through the family grapevine, he's heard the story. And so now he has admiration and pity on Ruth. He knows that if he helps Ruth, he's also helping, who else? Naomi. Yeah. And if he is in admiration for what Ruth has done because he values loyalty, then he wants to help Ruth because he knows it'll help Naomi. Okay? So none of this is weird when we understand what he understands and we look at his worldview. Okay? So, and in the lesson I just kind of showed that in a sense, Abram, before he became Abraham, the same sort of thing. He goes by faith to a land he doesn't know. So does Ruth. So in a sense, there's that sort of kind of She's not Abraham, but she's coming to a land she doesn't know, and she has such faith and loyalty to do that. Okay? So, are we good? Verse 12 then. Okay? The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. He's actually speaking to her a blessing, isn't he? I mean, that's the language that's being used. But what's within that language? How does he see himself in this? Because, I mean, right? Who's doing everything? The Lord repay you, right? And so under whose wings you have come to take refuge. How is God doing this? He sees himself through him. So he understands his vocation is to provide this to her, even though in his mind, this is how God is working. Right? And so he's a man of faith. He's not boastful. He's not saying, well, look at me, look what I'm going to do. No. He's just saying, hey, I'm just here. This is where God has placed me. You're here. You came out here by faith. And God will take care of you. And part of the way that he'll do that is through me. So does this all make sense? Man, I don't think he's in love yet. But I think he will be. So, I mean, Joyce is saying he is. Well, could be, So sometimes guys fall pretty fast. So, okay. Are we ready to continue? Let's look at verse 13. Am I too excited about all this stuff? Because I'm like, man, there's so much cool stuff going on here. I'm like, let me share this with you. So it's like my son, Dad, I don't want to know that much. When I'm helping him with his homework. So, okay, verse 13. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes. Remember when we were going through Esther? And how Esther, when it was written, it was the term won favor as opposed to find or found favor. So Ruth is using the normal kind of use of language for that expression. So she found favor. Okay, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, meaning she's not using Lord in the calling him God at all, but recognizing him. I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, and for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. Okay, there we have it. There's just beautiful language, respect being used. No one's being arrogant. No one's being haughty or proud. And she's saying, you, repeats it a second time, you don't have to do any of this and you still would not be wrong. You could have just let me glean like any regular person, right? So there she is. So she took a little bit of initiative. At the, like, well, I kind of want to glean and let me in a special way. And so she probably did so. This is my guess, is that Naomi, and they're probably fairly desperate. Okay? And it's not just her gleaning, but, right, she's gleaning for two people. So, so in her mind, I need to do something because we need a serious amount of grain for the next week or we're going to be in trouble. Okay? And so this is me reading between the lines. Okay? So a lot of good stuff going on here. Okay? So before we move on, we'll take a short little excursion and we will take a look at this concept called a kinsman redeemer. Okay? And we'll look at it a little more in depth as we make our way through chapter 2. But on page 3, we'll just kind of bring this out just so we're aware of it and kind of what it is. This is one of the things that exists to help make sure that what? That women and children are taken care of. especially when the husband has died. That's really the primary purpose. As Ruth 2 begins, we learn Naomi has a kinsman. See? And this makes sense because in the New Testament, this still, within Judaism, this was still how things worked. Okay? And so even in the New Testament, when you're coming across a situation where this woman was a widow whose husband had died, who has no sons. And see, when we hear that, as we go, oh no, right there it just sets off like, it can't get any worse, right? I mean, that's the worst situation in the world that you could be. As a woman, to have no husband and no sons, and you're all alone, okay? So, and if that just happened, the extended family is supposed to pick up the slack. Supposed to, okay? But that often isn't the case, okay? Because people are selfish. And if it's not in their interest, they'll choose otherwise, okay? So we learn Naomi has a kinsman, a blood male relative of her deceased husband, Elimelech. Okay, so this means Ruth does as well. Under the Old Covenant, God gave a kinsman several responsibilities. Some entailed buying back a relative out of slavery to a non-Israelite. That could get expensive, okay? And buying back family property sold outside the family because of poverty. So we won't discuss what happened to Elimelech's property. We'll get to that in a moment, okay? So we know that there is this safety net that God has set up for his people, okay? And it involves this. So let's read verse 14, okay? And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, okay? Again, what does this tell us? She has special treatment because she's supposed to wait, right? She sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So he gave her lots, so that way there's left over. Why? Well, so she could take some to Naomi. That's why. So he's taking care of, and I don't know their exact relation, but I wouldn't say it's super close, because we'll find that out later on in the book of Ruth. Okay? So Boaz is just everywhere you turn, he's showing kindness and generosity which isn't needed. Okay? And Joyce says, well, yeah. And Joyce is thinking, well, it's more than generosity. It's because he's already fallen for her. Maybe. Okay? But the thing is, the text doesn't let us know that. Okay? So a preview of what to come. Let's take a look at this diagram on page 3 of the lesson. Because this is painting us a picture, in a sense, of our relationship with Christ. Okay? So here we have Boaz. So on the left-hand side, that's supposed to be Boaz. It never looks pretty in these black and white printings. So Boaz becomes a kinsman redeemer to Ruth, who is a Gentile, and brings her into his family and invites Ruth to his meal. That's, in a sense, a picture of what we have because of Christ. Jesus becomes our kinsman redeemer to us, Gentiles, and brings us into his family and invites us to his meal. So we can kind of see some of these parallels, right? And Ruth recognizes she doesn't deserve any of this, that this is lavish kindness from Boaz. And it's the same with us. We don't deserve any of this, of what Jesus does for us, but it's all lavish kindness. And so there we are. So there are some beautiful tie-ins. Okay, so along the way, we just kind of have to stop and proverbial smell the roses, I guess, or maybe the barley harvest. Okay? Verses 15 and 16. Okay. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves." Wait a minute, that's not gleaning, right? That's, yeah, that's not gleaning. Gleaning is picking up the leftover, but let her take some from the sheaves. You're the boss. We're going to get less harvest, but if you're cool with that, right? Just make sure I still get paid or whatever it is, right? Okay, boss. Sure, boss man. Let her glean even among the sheaves and do not reproach her. So, like, hey. So, even if you don't like this, he's the boss man. You go, okay, he has spoken. This is the way it is. That's how it works, right? And also pull out some of the bundles for her. What? So in other words, by accident, on purpose, right? Throw some stalks on the ground behind you. Okay. Maybe Joyce is right. Maybe he's bitten by the love bug. Okay? But whatever it is, this is extremely generous. And it honestly, it doesn't really make sense in that he doesn't have to provide this much. Because, in other words, he's giving them so much that they will be living in plenty. He's not merely keeping them from starvation. Okay? So he's saying, I want you and Naomi to live as well as I do when it comes to the grain harvest. Okay? Oh, total craziness here, but that's what's going on. And pull out some of the bundles for her and leave it to her for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So there you have it. Special treatment. She gets to glean before the other people who are the regular gleaners do. And oh, by the way, let her just, she can take some of the stalks and leave some behind. How many? Like one stalk per, bundle, or? Doesn't say. Okay. But this is very, very generous. Okay. So indeed, Boaz does show extraordinary kindness and generosity. And it's well beyond what was expected, or even the most generous person wouldn't usually be this lavish. Okay. So if you want to rely upon Joyce's intuition that Boaz has fallen in love, I guess we could hold that as a reasonable, pious opinion. Okay? Are we ready to continue? Okay. So now this is kind of what happened during the daytime, and now Ruth is going to return home with what in tow? Right? Lots of grain. Okay? So let's look at verses 17 and 18. Okay? So she gleaned in the field. It's just, the word is used as glean, but it would, there should be another word. I guess it's not officially harvesting, but something between gleaning and harvesting. So she gleaned / harvested in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay, so what's an ephah? Well, let's take a look. So, and then we'll look at verse 18 in a moment. So ephah is a transliteration. Okay, it's a volume. Like a bushel is a volume of grain, right? I don't know how much a bushel is, but I guess it's pretty big. Is a bushel a large amount? Oh, okay. Okay, so, yeah. So, but we know because we don't know exactly how much of an ephah is, but the ephah is referenced against something called a homer. We know what a homer is. Therefore, from knowing what a homer is, we can extrapolate what an ephah is. So in other words, so an ephah is about 4.7, we'll say 5 gallons of volume. This is after, right, removing the grain from the stalk. After, okay, and so let's continue to say exactly. So she gleaned, she gleaned in the field, and she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. So it hasn't yet been mealed, and she hasn't removed the chaff, but about 5 gallons. So she carried all of this with the stalk. So this was a lot. Okay, I'm wondering whether she had help to help her bring all of that home. I don't know. But it was a good amount of weight that she carried. Okay? So there is no, and this would have normally been, I think if you were a regular gleaner, maybe this would be like 2 weeks worth of gleanings or something. So, 2 weeks worth in one afternoon. Because, right, she had to wait a little bit to get permission from Boaz. So we don't know how long she had to wait. Okay? So, okay. So let's look at verse 18. Okay? And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought food out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Now, why would she take some into the city? Why doesn't she just, oh, well, we have all this grain, let's store it? And why is she taking some to the city? No, because she did all that at home. Yes, to trade or sell. See? So he's given her so much that the implication is, only glean here, I'm going to take care of you. So, okay, so I'm going to have enough for however, a week, and the rest I'm going to sell. Okay? That way we can get other things that we need. We all, you don't use barley stalks for clothing, right? So this also allows her to bring home some income. Wow. Man, he really is generous. Yes. Okay, okay. So I'll have to take those guys' so maybe 5 gallons, maybe that's about 29 pounds. So think, how much would it weigh with the stalks then? I don't know. So, okay. So there we have it. This is, wow. So let's look at verse 19. Because how is Naomi going to respond? Okay. Do we remember how Naomi was when she left Moab? Yeah, like, don't call me bitter. Because the Lord, right? The Lord did this to me. As opposed to just saying, well, we live in a fallen world and, no, God did this to me. So she was directly blaming God for the stuff that happened. Okay. And so, okay, let's see if she's still kind of bitter. Like, still call me bitter. So, okay, verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Why would she ask that? Because, this is not normal gleaning. Did you rob a wagon train? Right? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Yeah, so say Naomi's basically recognizing how the society works. Somebody had to be very generous for you. Because if you're able to get away with something like this for one day, not going to happen tomorrow, right? You're going to be found out and be in trouble. So Naomi is astounded, right? She doesn't say, praise God, right? Whereas she blamed God for her problems, she's not praising him yet, but she does recognize something extraordinary and unusual has happened. Okay? So I think that we could say, well, Naomi might be turning around. Okay? Not yet, but she's recognizing this. And so in her worldview, she'll say, well, God is involved in this in some way. Okay? But she knows that this is anything but normal. Okay? 19b. Okay? So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Well, Naomi's going to know the deal now, right? Because Boaz, oh, wait, we're related. Okay? And so if you're her mother-in-law, and you know Boaz isn't married, and you know he owns a lot of land, and you know he's a good man with a generous heart, and you know he knows how to farm because his land produces a good yield, what are you going to be doing? You bet. You bet. You know, he's a kind of a distant relative, and you know, maybe he might be able to become your kinsman redeemer. And then if that happens, there's a whole bunch of positive things that could happen. Okay? Like the property that Elimelech owned. Whatever happened to that? They all skedaddled and left town. And they were not in a good way. Probably sold their land in a time of famine. Probably. Maybe not. Okay? And if that's the case, you didn't get a very good price for it. But you took what you can get because we don't want to starve. Okay? So, well, if that's the case, then, a kinsman redeemer is supposed to buy the property back. So that way it can continue, you know, in the family, so on and so forth. Okay? So, let's look on the bottom of page 4 because there's a little bit more on kinsman redeemer. Okay? So redeemer, that's the word goel in the Hebrew. Okay? And that's supposed to be a male relative who will protect the family interests, really protect the women and the children, provide for them. And that's really to take the place of the husband who had died. And this is really more the case for someone who doesn't have sons. Because if you have sons, well, the property is going to go to the sons, right? And the sons are supposed to take care of the mother. And so, you know, the oldest son has the responsibility. And then if he can't or he dies, then it goes down the line. So, and that's the reason why when you look at who inherits the property, the first son gets the largest bulk of the property because he's supposed to take care of mom when dad dies. And if we look at demographics, who usually dies first? Yeah, not always, because usually the man is older because he has to provide for his family. Plus, they don't live as long. Usually by a couple of years. Plus, men are often involved in occupations that are more dangerous, which means there are more accidents which shorten the average man's lifespan. So you add all of this together, you go to the nursing home, and the women outnumber the men 8-1. Okay? And you go, man, when it's old, it's better to be a woman, right? So that's part of it. The first son gets most of the inheritance because of that reason. Okay? And so, number 2, you know, first one dies, number 2 then takes care of mom, so on and so forth down the line. So, you know, you want, in a rural economy, and you don't have giant machines doing stuff, you want lots of kids. Because there's lots of labor involved. Okay? So not like today where you go, oh man, 2 kids, how am I going to send them to college? Can't have a 3rd kid, right? So totally different environment. So redeemer, goel, okay? And so there are 2 main laws that kind of govern what a kinsman redeemer does and how he acts. So there is the Levirate law from Deuteronomy, and that really requires an eligible brother or another male relative, if no brother is alive, to marry his deceased brother's widow. Oh, that's so creepy. But this is to ensure property is passed on. I mean, the whole slew of things that the widow is taken care of. So, you know, there's no government that does this. There's no Social Security. The family's responsible. Okay? And since there's no son, so if the widow has a son, whose son does he officially become? Not the brother who's fulfilling his responsibility, but the dead husband's son. That's who he legally becomes. And all the property rights pass on to him. And then if there's a second son, then it's divvied up accordingly according to the law. Okay? So this is really if, right, no husband and no heirs. Okay? So this situation occurred earlier since Naomi and Ruth were widowed and neither had a living son. Okay? So someone in the family is supposed to step up to the plate and marry Naomi. Marry Ruth. And not only that, he not only has to provide for Ruth, he also has to take care of Naomi. So, this isn't just like, oh, hey, I like this woman, but, her mom's living at home, and, I don't, so it's more than that because you have to financially provide. Okay? So, I think a lot of guys will go, well, if there's a way that I could weasel out and get away with it, I will. So it's really a matter of how mean the scowls will be. You're such a scoundrel, you don't, okay, right? If you're really well-to-do, it'll be easier, but it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, okay? This is part of how it works, so that way your family doesn't starve. Okay? Here's the redemption law. Okay? Requires a kinsman redeemer to buy back the property of a near relative who is forced to sell it because of poverty. Most likely, this happened earlier because Elimelech's land was sold or leased because of the famine and of their time outside Israel. So, you see Ruth. Now let's just assume she is just gorgeous. And you're like, oh man, she's really nice looking. But you go, oh, but you mean I have to buy back the Elimelech's property, and I also have to take care of mom? Oh, no, ain't no woman that pretty in the world. Okay? So we can kind of see how things will often go. Okay? And we'll see some of that go on. Okay? But the thing is, we need, even though when we find out some of this goes on, we can't be too mean to the guy who's shirking his responsibilities. Okay? Yeah, he's a scumball, but he's not a super huge scumball because he has. It's one thing to say, okay, well, I'll marry her so that way. It's another thing to also have to take care of mom and buy back the property. That could be a large amount of debt. Okay? And do you want to incur that? Okay? So most often Scripture uses the term goel in association with God, which is how it should be. Okay? For example, God promised to his people, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. So, but this isn't only what God does, it's also who he is. He is the kinsman redeemer. Isaiah 41. This is Yahweh's declaration. Your redeemer, Goel, is the Holy One of Israel. See, so here we have the word redeemer is Goel in Hebrew. Okay. Jeremiah. Their redeemer, Goel, is strong. Yahweh of the heavenly armies is his name. Psalm 19, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart, very familiar psalm, be acceptable to you, Yahweh, my rock and my Goel. See? So right there we go, oh, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. Right? He buys us out of our slavery, which was also one of their responsibilities, right? He restores the inheritance that we lost. Oh, it's just beautiful. So when you understand kind of the whole concept and you see how it's fulfilled in Christ, okay, this whole idea of a goel in the Old Testament isn't so creepy. Because, it's like really creepy to our way of thinking. I'm going to marry my brother's wife, dude. No way. Right? El is a shortened form of Elohim. So, and that's, so a lot of names. Nathaniel. El, gift of God. See, so a lot of the El endings are actually Hebrew names, which in some way tie into who someone is in relation to God. Okay, so Goel carries with it the idea that God is behind these acts of redemption, which includes caring for this widow. And that brings us back to what Boaz earlier said: the Lord will shelter you under his wings. Meaning, it may very well be Boaz who's doing that. Okay? Let's look at verses 21 through 23, and we'll end there, and we'll start with chapter 3 next week. Okay. And Ruth the Moabite said, she's still called the Moabite. Besides, he said to me, so in her conversation, right, with Naomi, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So, I don't know if Naomi's hyping this up a bit, but it could happen, right? So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, so reading between the lines, Boaz is still taking care of Ruth. Okay, and things are still going well. She's still able to take the extra grain to market and sell it. So Ruth and Naomi may not be, as in our expression, living high on the hog, but they are doing okay. They are not in want of anything. They are not starving. And Ruth is bringing home some income, all because of Boaz's generosity. And how he sees this, he's simply saying, God is using me I'm expressing God's generosity toward her. Okay, so even though he may be smitten, okay, he's also a man of faith, and so he understands his role of vocation, and he's responding accordingly. Okay, are we good? Let's close with a prayer, and we'll make our way to the divine service. Our Father, we are indeed thankful for the life of Ruth and Boaz, and how we can understand in some ways where Boaz foreshadows what your Son did and does for us. May we look to him and recognize the generosity that we receive because of his generous hand, in whose name we pray. Amen.